What if I told you that your teacher, who you see in school every day, is actually an undercover spy? Well, that was the case for one gentleman in Germany. His name, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And his story has been told throughout the world and now is ready to be told to our school children as well. Molly Wilmington is the author of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the teacher who became a spy. And she joins me to talk about that book and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a name that so many of us know, the famous spy during World War II who attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And yet there's so much about him that we don't know. And how do we begin to tell stories about heroes like Bonhoeffer to our children? Well, that's the mission of Molly Wilmington. She's the author of the new children's book, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the teacher who became a spy, and she joins us here tonight. Molly, welcome to Face the Issues. It's so great to see you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
I would absolutely love having you here. And let's just get into this. Your book, it's a children's book, and it is about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Again, so this is somebody who I think is becoming more famous in circles, but something that a lot of people don't know about. So for our viewers who may not know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, can you give us an overview? Who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of times people will refer to Dietrich Bonhoeffer for his letters and papers from prison. So they'll put him alongside Martin Luther King Jr., and then you'll hear quotes, from letter from a Birmingham jail, and then also from Bonhoeffer being in Berlin in a prison. People also talked about him in sermons. He wrote about ethics and being strong in your faith, and also about living life together. So a lot of our churches where we have these growth groups or family groups that get together, a lot of that comes from him and some other people too. But many of the people who have formed those groups in your churches have read the book Life Together. So people are still reading the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And in certain parts of the country, he is as famous as Billy Graham or Mother Teresa, and in parts of America as well. So that's one of the great things, is that when parents see, and teachers and pastors see this on the shelf, they're going to be excited because they already know Dietrich Bonhoeffer's story. Eric Metaxas published a book on him a few years ago, about 10 years ago now, and it sold millions of copies and was translated into multiple languages. And the original book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer's best friend came out 20 years after Bonhoeffer's death, and it has sold millions of copies as well. So people keep reading the biographies and they keep reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings, and they admire him for standing up for his faith. And many people will say, well, he was an ordinary man who did extraordinary things. And I think that's true of many people who stood up against Hitler. We just don't know all their stories.
Sure. An ordinary man who did extraordinary things. Molly, tell us a little bit about what is it that rocketed Bonhoeffer to fame in World War II? What is the extraordinary thing that we're talking about?
Well, Bonhoeffer was definitely a leader of the church. So there was a big struggle within Germany when Hitler took power. He knew he had to squash the leadership of the church. And he did that very subtly, but he also did it in some big ways. And the subtle ways is where Bonhoeffer and other leaders were getting together and coming up with statements and challenging the authority of Hitler to do what he was doing. And it was different. It was really difficult for them. It was over the course of 12 years that Hitler was in power. And it was very gradual. So just one edict after another, one law after another, taking away people's rights. It was very hard for the pastors, but then also the people beyond that to organize in Germany to rise up against him, because they took away the power of the press and the right for people to even write letters. And that's one of the things I say in my book, too, is that I want children to understand, one, why did people in Germany have to hide their letters, like Bonhoeffer's niece and best friend did? And why did they have to be careful talking on the phone? Because your phones could be tapped or your houses could be searched. There were so many ways that their freedoms were taken away. And Hitler did that in the very first month that he took power. He took away those rights that people could have their letters read, phones tapped, and houses searched. So it was very difficult for them to stand up. Now, Bonhoeffer was also part of the resistance because he lived in Berlin, and several of his family members were either connected with military intelligence or directly in military intelligence. So they were already working together. So some people may know of the movie with Tom Cruise called Valkyrie. And I think his name is Stauffenberg is how you pronounce it. He was part of that inner group. And there were some other groups that were organized in other parts of the country as well. And I think one of the biggest things to remember too is that the first country that Hitler attacked is Germany. He had to conquer his own people first. And Bonhoeffer actually left the country right before the war started. His age group was up for military service. And I don't say this in the book because my book is an intro book for children, but we as adults know that if you didn't actually serve in Germany when you were called up to be a soldier, you would be shot just right there and killed immediately. No trial, nothing. And so Bonhoeffer had left Germany knowing that the war was coming, and he was over in America. But within a month of going to America, he realized if he wanted to be part of helping his country rebuild after the war, then he needed to be in Germany helping to fight against it. Now, when Hitler took power, they didn't think he was going to be in power long. I mean, they knew how dangerous he was. The inner circles did. But they didn't think it was going to last. They didn't think he was going to have that propaganda and that control and be that ruthless and fast of taking hold of everything. So the reason we say he's a spy is that when he came back to Germany, he wanted to be a chaplain in the military because then he would not be required to be fighting, but he could still be the pastor he was. Then they wouldn't let him because he had been outside of what was approved by the Nazis as who could be a pastor and who couldn't because of his resistance within the church. So that's when his family members said, why don't you be a spy for Germany and you'll really be a double agent and you'll be collecting and sharing information with other countries and helping us within our country. So he really was a double agent. I did explain that originally in my first versions of the book, but there just wasn't time. So we just call him a spy. But it's a very exciting story. And for anybody who wants to learn more, I'd recommend, there's many great biographies out there.
Yeah. I mean, again, to your point, this is somebody who is living a fairly ordinary life, I think as many of us live, and ends up coming back to Germany, as you said, not just becomes a spy, but becomes a double agent. And a challenge I don't think we always realize in America, we tend to be very patriotic. We tend to support our country, even when we disagree with its leaders. But to have to step into a place where you are serving your country and yet you're serving it by trying to stop them, a very difficult kind of patriotism. Molly, let me ask you this. Why did you decide to write about Bonhoeffer? I mean, many different heroes of history, heroes of our faith that we can write about. What was it about Bonhoeffer's life that inspires you?
Well, one thing that I saw, first of all, is that there weren't any children's books on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, there's older kids' books, but they're a little bit scary or they're a little bit boring. There's just because they're for older kids, right? They're not for the younger child. And then I was looking at my own kids, and they wanted to have superheroes in their life, right? They wanted to act out stories. And then also in Sunday school, I very quickly realized my children were bored in Sunday school if I told them all of the Bible stories at home, because that's what they were learning in Sunday school. So I purposely didn't tell my daughter that many of the stories, she was my second born, from the Bible, because I wanted her to enjoy Sunday school. Well, I also wanted her to know of other Christians and their stories. And Bonhoeffer and William Wilberforce were two people I had been reading about. And I kept looking just in the local library or, keeping my eye open for some and couldn't find them. Well, years ago, I read a children's book, well, a book on how to write a children's book and get it published. That's actually its title. And my grandmother gave it to me. So I had read that years ago. I was already interested in writing children's books. So what I did is I knew you had to have a kind of foot in the door in the publishing world to get going. I had a friend in the publishing world, Carrie Mars, that you might remember, Dan and Carrie. And so she had said, if you have any ideas, let me know. And I knew that was my green light finally. So I went to the Baylor University Library and sat down with a librarian, and we searched through all the catalogs to see what was out there on Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer. And I a few weeks later had this little stack of books to read. But again, nothing for the younger child. Everything was for that middle-aged range. And I actually think you can tell this story, even though it's about Hitler and World War II, you can tell it to younger children, just like you can tell about the battles in the Bible. You don't talk about the blood and gore on the battlefield when you read children's books or you read stories from the Bible, but you do talk about the big stories. When you really look at Noah's Ark, that's a pretty scary story. Or if you really look at one of the other ones, kids are fascinated by King David with Goliath, and they know that the world is a scary place. And they know that they need to be prepared and use their strengths to stand firm against the bad guys in the world. So that's why I researched those books. And the interesting thing is even though Wilberforce is very interesting, loved animals and children and connected really well with his kids, I didn't find a single story. So I found all these stories on Bonhoeffer, and I said, well, I guess that's where I'm going. And I called Carrie back up, and I was like, well, by the way, Carrie, did you know it's your publishing house that published Eric Metaxas's book? And she said, oh yeah, I'm actually working with him right now on a children's book. So it turned out it was for an older child though. So it was okay. It wasn't a conflict or anything. So I didn't actually end up publishing with them, but it helped me on my journey. And it's been really exciting to see where God's led it.
Yeah, and here we are. Great shout out to, for our viewers who don't know, Dan and Carrie are great friends of both mine and Molly's. And so I love that shout out. Molly, you brought up something fascinating about how we tell stories that might be difficult when we're talking about the Holocaust and Hitler, but we can tell these to kids. And so we're going to go to the break first, but when we come back, I want to talk about that process of writing a children's book and how do you present these difficult stories of history. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Molly, thank you again for joining us. And I love where you left off. You're talking about why a children's book and these great historic figures that a lot of times we've got books for adults and maybe for older children. But to your point, a lot of times kids want to have heroes in life. And there are heroes in history that we can put before them. So I appreciate where your heart is in this. But you did bring up a difficulty of sometimes these stories, and we know history involves profound darkness. And Bonhoeffer is a light in the midst of profound darkness. William Wilberforce, who you brought up earlier, is the same boat. Great hero, great story, but you need to understand the darkness of the transatlantic slave trade to understand Wilberforce's story. And you need to understand Hitler and the darkness of the Holocaust to understand Bonhoeffer's story. Is that a challenge when you're writing a children's book? And how do you go about that, talking about something that we can't ignore or lie about, but is also very challenging to talk with young children about?
Mm-hmm. The way that I approach telling stories to children is you want to think about the stories that they are interested in, what connects them. So in the beginning of the book, I talk about how Bonhoeffer loved children and how he also loved to make jokes. So a lot of times people think of Bonhoeffer as this very serious academic man, which he definitely was, but he had an amazing ability to connect with children and love them and care for them, but also just capture their attention. So I found those stories. And then I also found stories of when he was in prison about the things he did. I had a teacher read my book in the early versions, and he said, this part is really important to kids because one of the things Bonhoeffer did is he shared food with other people when they were sick in prison. And he didn't get much food to begin with either. So that meant he was giving up his food. And the teacher pointed out to me that for children, that's important because that's one of the few things they can do to help their classmates when their classmate forgets their lunch at school. So they can share some of their food. And that is their power of blessing somebody else. And so children can picture themselves, okay, if I end up in prison someday, I'm not just going to be lonely and scared and whatever else a child might fear about prison, but they can also say, God's going to use me if I were to be in prison, or if I were to be in some place that's like a prison, or, just hard times in life, God can still use me to bless other people. So you use these interesting stories to capture the children's attention, and then you weave together part of the story. The hardest challenge is doing it in 32 pages. And thankfully, I had quite a while to work on this. So I really was able to just use that scalpel and cut, so you can do it. And once you have children, you even are a little more sensitive to what is appropriate at different ages. Mm-hmm. So this book is appropriate for all ages, actually. I've read it to families, to church groups where there were children as young as 3 in the room, children all the way up to 17, 18. And they all learn from it. And then families have read it to their children. And they talk about how wonderful it was to have a conversation with all their kids. And of course, they're sensitive to the younger ones when they're having a conversation. So they're not saying things that would scare the younger ones, but the older ones, they could even have further conversations with later. And it's really wonderful. And I had this 4-year-old who only heard the beginning of my story. And 6 months later, she said, you read your book to me. And I said, yeah, that's right. I read you 5 books at, Sunday during Sunday school. And she said, you read your book to me. And I looked at her and she said, and she just was thinking, you could see the wheels turning. She said, there was a teacher and a dog and he was a spy. And she was so excited, and she'd only heard the first third of the book. So you can definitely do it. And I would also say, this is an introduction. I don't say how Hitler died. I don't say that Bonhoeffer died. I do say that the two of them die. And I don't say that anybody else dies. Mm-hmm. So it's an introduction. And when children ask me, how did Hitler die or Bonhoeffer, I say, ask your parents or talk to your parents. And I've even told kids it's a sad thing and we don't need to talk about it right now. Mm-hmm. Or, there's just different ways that you can handle it. And you can say you can learn and read more about Bonhoeffer as you get older. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, that's such a great approach to it, Molly. I think we often think of history, and we see this in school sometimes where they go, well, we've covered American history in 5th grade, so we're not going to cover it again in high school. Well, I mean, we're much different people when we're 15, 16, 17 than when we're 7, 8, or 9. And our depth of understanding is going to change. And so I really appreciate this approach of let's introduce our children to history, to heroes of history, heroes of the faith. We're not going to be able to tell them the entire story. We're not going to, I don't think any of us are advising that we take 4, 5, 6-year-olds to the Holocaust Museum or to Auschwitz. I mean, we're not at a place where they're going to be able to process that. And yet we can begin to introduce them to these realities of history and to the people who stood out in them. And so I appreciate and admire the approach that you've taken to doing this.
That makes me think of one other thing. In the book, I use a theme that's not really advertised on the outside of the book. Mm-hmm. And it's the theme of Jesus being the good shepherd, and that Bonhoeffer was like a good sheepdog who followed Jesus, the good shepherd, and stood firm against the evil wolf, Hitler. So I'm using this more simplified storytelling theme throughout the book to help children understand the more complex ideas of World War II, Hitler, and, standing firm and laying down your life for the sake of the master, for the sheep, all that. And I say how Bonhoeffer was like a good sheepdog. And I do have a really cute puppy sheepdog tell the story. And he's throughout the whole story having different reactions based on what's going on. But he's also the narrator. So it's fun for children. to enjoy that.
Molly, listen, I was part of the Wishbone generation on PBS.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so having a dog tell a story is, to me, the best way of having a story told. And so let me ask you this. I mean, when you tell these stories, in this case, Bonhoeffer's story, to kids, what do you hope they can learn from Bonhoeffer's life? Obviously, there's a lot that all of us can learn from Bonhoeffer's life, but what lessons do you want the kids who read this to take away?
My greatest hope is for them to know Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Because if you follow Jesus, the Good Shepherd, you're going to know love, you're going to know security, comfort, what it means to be brave. What else? And most of all, what it means to be loved. With Bonhoeffer, we can all see that too in his witness and how he grew in his faith and kept reading the Bible and kept asking God questions and learning. And wherever he was always seeking to serve God.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think even among adults, we often think, or we hope that we have these heroes sometimes and I think the beautiful thing, the heroic thing about Bonhoeffer is that he struggles with some of these decisions and he is reliant on his faith. It's not cut and dry or black and white. And he says he feels called to do certain things that he's not sure the rest of the church is called to do. And I know for me, that's been a huge help in my journey as I've read Bonhoeffer's works.
Yeah.
Molly, I appreciate that breakdown of what you're doing and your approach to all of this. We're going to go cut to another break, and when we come back, understand you've got another book in the works, and so we're going to talk about that. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Molly, thank you again for joining us. And as we close out, two quick questions. I mean, the first is that your book is part of a larger series. Who are some of the other great heroes of our history and of our faith that children can read about?
Mm-hmm. When I pitched my book, I suggested that it could be part of a series where we could have a different animal tell each story. And I hope someday to write on William Wilberforce, who helped in the slave trade and eventually slavery in England. And they went ahead and chose the next two and chose different people to write them, which is fine. It takes years sometimes to write a children's biography. This summer will be the next book on C.S. Lewis, and it's so cute. It's being told by an owl named after G.K. Chesterton, and the owl's name is Gilbert. And then the next book is on Lottie Moon, and she was a missionary to China, and hers is being told by this cute panda holding an umbrella on the cover. So I don't know as much about the panda's name, but I'm sure it's going to be a great story.
That's exciting. That's exciting.
And
go ahead, Molly.
Go ahead. I think you were going to ask me about my next children's book that I have.
Yeah, you've got another one coming out yourself.
Well, it's not coming out yet. It's not under contract, but I'm waiting till, all this launches and then I'm going to send it off to my publisher. But it's called either Mommy's Little Ladybug or Mama's Little Ladybug. And it starts off by, Mama, why do you call me your little ladybug? Well, that's because the first time I saw you, you were the size of a ladybug. And then what happens in the story is that I keep talking about the different names that the child had in the womb, and we talk about what the child could do at each stage, and the child gets excited and interacts back with the mother. Like I say, did you know your heart was beating twice as fast as mine? And the child says, wow, and jumps up, runs across the room and says, I'm still fast, and dives back into the mom's arms. So you kind of have that little repeating theme, and I do 3 months, and then the child says, well, how big was I on the day that God created me? And so we talk about that, and it's really sweet. And the child says, and I talk about how the child grew and was due on Christmas Day. And it is based loosely on my own children, and both of them were due on Christmas Day. And then my favorite two parts toward the end is one is based on my husband, where the child says, well, what did you call me on the day I was born? And the mother says, baby hippo. And the child says, was I that big? no, Daddy just thought it was funny. And I want this picture of somebody kind of like my husband holding this big baby hippo with a pacifier in his mouth. And I just think that's going to be the children's favorite part of the whole book. But then it ends with something I've always wanted in a children's book. I've been thinking for years about writing this, is the scripture verse, "You are fearfully and wonderfully made." So Psalm 139. And I looked, and there are several children's books that are pretty much a straight retelling of that scripture. So at the end of this book, I will say, "It's time to go to bed. Do you know that you still grow while you sleep?" And the child says, "Wow, I'm going to be even bigger tomorrow." I said, "That's right. Now let's have your good night blessing." And I say, I stroke their hair, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Be at peace and grow well, my child." And I love that it not only does it end with the nicknames for the child, but it also ends with the names of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that peaceful going to sleep. And so I'm hoping that what I used to do to my children then will bless, these children too, to know that comfort and that joy, what it means to be celebrated and growing in the womb. But even this 5 or 6-year-old who's reading with their parent, or 3 or 4-year-old, can also be, every night that they read this with their parents, can feel that love and that being cherished.
Yeah. And Molly, you raised 2 fantastic kids, and so I love that you're now sharing that with the rest of the world. And so, Molly, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Again, the book is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the teacher who became a spy. That is our show for tonight. Again, I want to thank Molly Wilmington for joining us. I want to thank each of you for tuning in, and we hope to see you right back here again next week. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.